Welcome, night wanderer. You've had a long day, and now it's time to let go, to drift into the quiet, into the comfort of the night. Here, in this moment, nothing else matters. The world outside fades, and all that remains is you and the stories waiting to be told. These tales are not meant to startle, but to gently guide you into the realm of dreams. Let the words flow like a lullaby, wrapping you in mystery and wonder. Listen closely, let your mind wander, and allow yourself to sink into the calm embrace of sleep. Close your eyes, relax your breath, and let the stories begin. 1. The Whispering Fog. The town of Black Hollow was shrouded in mist every night. But it wasn't just fog, it whispered. The townspeople had long feared the voices that drifted through the heavy mist, warning their children never to listen too closely. Those who did were never seen again. Amelia, a fearless young woman, dismissed these superstitions as mere stories. One evening, she set out to prove that there was nothing lurking in the fog. Wrapping her coat tightly around her, she ventured beyond the town's borders, where the mist grew thick and cold. At first, it was silent except for the crunch of leaves beneath her boots. But as she walked deeper into the fog, she began to hear the voices, soft at first, like wind brushing through the trees. Then, clearer. "Come closer," they whispered. She stopped. The voices were everywhere, circling her, beckoning her forward. Figures began to emerge from the mist, tall, distorted shapes that flickered in and out of existence, watching her with hollow eyes. Her breath hitched as she took a step back, but the fog clung to her like unseen hands. Panic surged through her. She turned to run but tripped over something soft. Looking down, she found herself surrounded by piles of shoes, old, tattered, and covered in dust. Some were small, like those of a child. Others were worn with deep imprints, as if the owners had stood there for a very long time. A cold dread seeped in her bones. The whispers grew louder, desperate. "Stay with us. Stay." Everything went black. The next morning, Amelia awoke in her bed, her head pounding. Sunlight streamed through the window, but something felt off. She sat up, her heart still racing. How had she gotten home? Her clothes were damp with dew, her hands scratched from the underbrush. Then she saw them, muddy footprints leading from her window to her bedside. They were not hers. 2. The mirror in the attic. Daniel had always been drawn to his grandmother's attic. It was a place of forgotten relics, dusty trunks, faded paintings, and shelves of books that no one had touched in decades. But the mirror was what fascinated him the most. It was large and ornate, its gilded frame lined with strange symbols he didn't recognize. The glass itself seemed darker than normal, as though it held shadows within. The first time he looked into it, he saw nothing unusual, just his own reflection staring back. But the more time he spent in the attic, the more the mirror seemed to change. Some nights, his reflection would linger a second too long after he moved. Other nights, he swore he saw something standing behind him, just beyond his shoulder, though when he turned around, there was nothing there. One evening, he decided to test it. He set up his phone to record while he sat in front of the mirror. He forced himself to stare into the glass, ignoring the feeling of unseen eyes on him. Then it happened. His reflection blinked. He had not. A chill ran down his spine. He leaned closer, studying his own face. His reflection smirked. Daniel did not. His pulse hammered in his ears as he scrambled backward. The mirror vibrated, a faint whisper escaping from its depths. Then, a hairline crack appeared across the surface. His own face fractured before his eyes. The reflection was no longer smiling. It was grinning. Daniel fled the attic, slamming the door behind him. That night, as he lay in bed, trying to convince himself it had all been in his head, he heard it, soft breathing, coming from the attic. 3. The house that called my name. Lisa had always been drawn to the abandoned house on Maple Street. It stood alone, its windows dark and empty, its paint peeling like old skin. The locals whispered that those who entered never returned. For years, she ignored the house, dismissing the stories as rumors. But the whispers, those were real. Every time she walked by, she could hear them calling her name. One cold evening, curiosity overcame her fear. She stopped in front of the house, and, for the first time, answered. "Hello." The wind howled through the trees, and the door creaked open as if inviting her inside. She hesitated but stepped forward. The air within was thick and stale, carrying the scent of something long forgotten. The floorboards groaned under her weight as she ventured deeper into the house. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her. They were urgent now, pleading. A sudden chill ran down her spine. She turned to leave, but the door was gone. Panic surged through her veins. She spun around, searching for another exit, but the house had changed. The walls stretched endlessly, doors led to nowhere, and the shadows in the corner shifted, watching her. Then she heard it, a voice, her own voice, calling from upstairs. Lisa backed away, her pulse hammering in her ears. The whispers turned into laughter, deep and guttural. She ran, blindly rushing through the twisting corridors. But no matter which way she turned, she found herself back in the same dim hallway. The air around her grew heavy, pressing against her chest like unseen hands. And then silence. The next day, Maple Street was quiet. The house stood as it always had, dark and waiting. But some claimed that if you listened closely, just beyond the howling wind, you could still hear Lisa's voice, calling for help. 4. The vanishing roommate. Jake's roommate, Sophie, had been missing for days. He assumed she had left town without a word until he found her phone. Its screen cracked but still recording. Curious, he pressed play. The last video sent a chill down his spine. Sophie sat on the bed, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. The camera shook as she whispered, "It's here." Jake frowned. "What's here?" he muttered to himself, rewinding the video. Then, something in the background caught his eye. The closet door was slightly ajar, and within the darkness, a shadow moved. A cold sweat broke over his skin. He turned to glance at the closet. It was open, just an inch. He hadn't noticed before. Heart pounding, he stepped toward it. He reached out, fingers grazing the wood. Slam! The door shut violently. The room fell into silence. Jake stumbled back, gasping. He grabbed his phone to call for help, but his screen flickered and went dark. The air around him thickened, pressing against his chest. A whisper curled around his ear. "You saw me." The next day, Jake was gone. The apartment was empty, undisturbed, except for Sophie's phone, still lying on the floor, its screen flashing the last recorded frame. The closet door stood open, waiting, the radio static. Tom's old radio sat on the nightstand, a relic of a bygone era. It wasn't much, just a simple analog radio with cracked dials and a faded leather exterior. But it was a comforting presence in his otherwise quiet room. Every night, Tom would listen to the static, its soft hum filling the space, lulling him to sleep. At first, the static was just that, static. But over time, Tom began to notice something strange. Some nights, the static seemed to shift, the crackling sounds turning into barely audible whispers. He told himself it was just his imagination playing tricks. Radios picked up strange frequencies, he reasoned. No harm in that. But then it happened. One evening, as the moonlight poured in through the window, Tom sat on his bed with a book in hand, the radio quietly humming beside him. The static was unusually loud that night, almost like a storm was brewing in the airwaves. Suddenly, a voice cut through the noise, his own voice. "It's behind you." Tom froze, his breath catching in his throat. He turned quickly, his eyes darting around the room, heart racing. The shadows in the corners remained still. Nothing was there. He shook his head, muttering to himself, "It's just the static. It's nothing." The next night, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. As he sat in his usual spot, the radio crackled louder than usual, almost deafening in its intensity. His hand hovered over the dial, ready to turn it off, but then the voice returned. "Turn around." It whispered, low and guttural. Tom's blood ran cold. He didn't want to. He really didn't. But something inside him compelled him to do it. Slowly, he turned around, his eyes scanning the dimly lit room. For a split second, he saw it. A figure standing in the corner by the window, pale, gaunt, with eyes too dark to see. It grinned at him, its mouth wide and stretched unnaturally. The lights flickered. Tom gasped, his body frozen with fear. But before he could react, the room went dark. The static continued, but it sounded different now. Closer, as if the radio was right next to him, whispering into his ear. Tom's heart hammered in his chest. He scrambled to get out of bed, but his legs wouldn't move. Panic set in as the voice began to grow louder, its words twisting and distorting, becoming a jumble of growls and laughter. The lights flickered again, and Tom could barely make out the figure. Closer now, its grin widening with each passing second. He closed his eyes, hoping it was all a bad dream. But when he opened them again, he saw nothing. The room was empty, silent. The radio, however, was still crackling. Tom slowly reached for the dial, his hands trembling. But before he could touch it, he saw the reflection in the window. His own face, his own eyes staring back at him, were not his own. They were hollow, empty, and they grinned. The unfinished lullaby. Sarah had always been a light sleeper, but the sound of her baby's quiet breathing on the monitor soothed her to sleep each night. She had always felt a calm sense of security, knowing her baby was just down the hall, nestled in the crib with the soft hum of a lullaby playing in the background from the baby monitor. But one night, that lullaby sounded different. It started playing around midnight, just as it always did, but this time the melody was off. Sarah's heart fluttered with unease as the soft notes of the lullaby played. The sound seemed distant, but the words weren't right. She could hear the familiar humming, but it wasn't her voice. Her throat tightened. She had never set the monitor to pick up anything other than her own lullaby. As a mother, she always preferred the comfort of her own voice soothing her baby to sleep. The unsettling lullaby continued for a moment before Sarah, wide-eyed and cautious, tiptoed toward the nursery. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination running wild. After all, the monitor was a bit old. It was possible the static made things sound strange. But when she reached the doorway of the nursery, she stopped dead in her tracks. There in the corner of the room sat a figure in the rocking chair. A shadowy form swayed gently, rocking back and forth in time with the lullaby's eerie rhythm. The figure hummed the song softly, a melody Sarah had never heard before, one that seemed almost too familiar. Her pulse quickened, and she felt a chill run down her spine. Sarah slowly reached for the light switch, her breath shallow as the melody continued to drift from the monitor, filling the space around her. She knew she had to act fast. Her hand trembled as she flicked the switch. The room flooded with light, but the rocking chair was empty. There was no shadow, no figure, nothing but the baby's empty crib. Her heart pounded in her chest as she rushed over to check on her child. The crib was undisturbed, the baby sound asleep, completely unaware of the eerie presence that had lingered moments before. Yet the lullaby kept playing. Sarah turned to the baby monitor, and her breath caught in her throat. The screen was still showing the faint static noise, but there was no sign of anything unusual on it. The lullaby was still there, echoing softly from the monitor. Her mind raced, her stomach twisted in knots. She quickly grabbed the monitor and turned it off, but the melody continued. It wasn't coming from the monitor, nor from the room itself. It felt like the melody was right beside her, inside her ears, humming softly. Sarah stood frozen in the dark silence of the nursery, her mind unable to comprehend what had just happened. The humming was gone now, but the feeling of being watched lingered.